Good morning or good afternoon, in some instances, good evening. Welcome to the ECHO 2020 Summit. This is our final event in a very special series of leadership soundbites we've hosted throughout this month, reflecting the importance of leadership, reputation, and trust at a time of great change and challenge. For those who haven't been with us before, please use the chat room for today's discussion to raise any comments or questions, and hopefully I'll be able to call on you to ask them at the end of our half-hour session for a brief 10 minutes Q&A at the end. As we look to the future, and to help set the scene, ECHO asked 300 business leaders about their top learnings from the pandemic, and this is what they said. In rank order, top insights, top learnings, having the culture and capacity to adapt and pivot, and attention to people first, being mental health, well-being, working from home, all those issues, with really interesting comments. And these are from C-suites, everything from general counsel to chief executive and chairman, saying, really learned about the value of our culture, the importance of inspirational leadership, trusting our people, recognizing the passion of our frontline workers. And also, I think we would all echo this, just how important key workers are to the physical and economic health of the nation. And as we lead into this current session, we also asked our business leaders, what are they planning as they look to the future? And yes, aside from saying, a huge reduction in travel, 73%, we also see the focus on people coming through much more strongly than before. And this is reflected again in our C-suite comments of saying, supporting flexible working. Rather than going back to normal, it's about embedding changes in a positive and productive way. And a big emphasis on diversity at leadership level. So with that, please welcome our very, very special speakers today, ECHO's advisory board member, Rosie Halfhead. Rosie, welcome. In conversation with Diana Wu David, TEDx speaker and female futurist based in Hong Kong, about inspiring a new future that matters in this age of acceleration. Thank you both for being with us. Rosie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and I'm delighted to be here. Diana and I have known each other for years in different guises. When I was Chief Communications Officer in Global Financial Services, and she was at the FT in a Regional Marketing Director role. And I've stayed connected with her ever since, and have recently finished the Future Proof course that she created a little while ago and is now in its 4th cohort. She's a futurist, an author, a speaker, educator, board director, advisor, mentor, wife, and mother of 3. And the organizations she's associated with go from the Financial Times to the Future World Forum, Global Think Tank, American Chamber in Hong Kong, TEDx, Columbia Business School, London Business School, Hong Kong University, not to mention early days with Dr. Kissinger. And last week, she was recognized in the Analytica's Who's Who of Influences on the Future of Work. So we really are in great company for this final session. Welcome, Diana.
Thank you, Rosie.
Sandra quoted Abraham Lincoln at the opening session of this series and said, the best way to predict the future is to create it. And you've written, I'm always looking to the future to determine what I need to start thinking about. So give us a little flavor of Diana, the futurist.
Well, after 20 years of navigating corporate disruption, so for 20 years, I really have been thinking about the future professionally. A few years ago, I noticed that other senior executives were dealing with a lot of personal disruption, as was I, related to the future of work. So partly, I think what I found is that's because we have more future to deal with. So Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott talked about the 100-year life and the fact that since 1840, we're adding 3 months to our lives every single year. Now that's plateaued out in certain countries, but basically it made me think about the future of work. And I took some time off to write the Future Proof book and launch the Future Proof course for senior executives and start doing more advisory for companies and boards who were thinking about creating that future proactively. And that has been, my journey to become much more full-time futurist and helping people create inspiring futures that matter.
So let's get into the content. And we'd just like to invite everybody who's on this sort of session today to sort of expand your horizons, open your minds. And for the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to explore some different themes and sprinkled hopefully with some examples with an Asian flavor. So how do you see the future of work? It's a big question, but what are the biggest trends that you're seeing and in what time frames?
So the three trends that I talked about in my book were really technology, somewhat, broad themes, technology, globalization, and demographics. So we talked about the 100-year life. I think that this means more careers. It means different rhythms because people just starting now are looking out at 60 years and saying, maybe I'm going to do a tour of duty of 2 years, and then I'm going to do a little bit of learning or take some time off for family or, art or whatever it is. So a completely different rhythm because of demographics. And that's something that's changing slowly, but companies, I think, are fundamentally unprepared for. It also means that the onus is on us to tell our own narrative as we jump from company to company and culture to different, to country, really. So everybody is being called upon to be more entrepreneurial, to really be looking out for their company, because the other research I did says that company lifespans are actually declining while ours are increasing. And so we're now having to be more flexible and kind of the chief communication officers of our own careers. And then when you add on to that, things like technology enabled virtual collaboration and remote working, which is a long-term trend, transparency, which we see in the press as surveillance politics, and on the positive side, it can be contact tracing, and oftentimes both have really had a big impact on companies and people. And we have MTR here, which is actually also bid for work in London. And Raymond Chen, the former chairman, explained it to me as, what is a world where I can find out more about whether or not the trains are running on time on Twitter than I can from my own staff. So that transparency is fundamentally shifting how we run our companies and how we work, and in my opinion, for the positive.
So is there a kind of gig economy 2.0 coming? I read actually last week a piece in the World Economic Forum, and I'm going to quote, it says, the next COO of your company will work remotely, stay with the company for 6 months, never even get a company email account, but will be the best hire they've ever made. So what's your thinking there in the context of more gig for knowledge workers, and what does that do for the businesses?
Well, since 2016, I think Diane Mulcahy wrote Gig Economy and talked about work in any kind of structure, good work beyond a job, but just about the work that you can do. And it's hard for us to imagine, but I see that everywhere. There's something called virtual board advisors in Europe, where people are in almost a guild to give advice to different companies. Here in Asia, we just had a bunch of alumni of the Financial Times Board Director Program launch Your Board for small and medium enterprises. And it's like a crowdsourced board member with 15 people from different disciplines, and you put forth your board question and they give you a variety of different answers. So, you would never think that the gig economy, I suppose being a board director is to a certain extent a gig job anyway, but those are the kind of levels you see in the gig economy. And I think that is really here to stay. Last night I was on a call with the executive MBAs in Singapore, and they don't even think job security is, it's not on their radar. They want to know what companies are going to offer beyond financial rewards and in place of job security. And we talked about things like learning, so that, every job you look at has an element of how much it can add to your skills and your experience to continue expanding the options and opportunities that you have.
So that's interesting in terms of what they're looking for, but you've also got this other context of the enablement that's happening, and the examples you've just given. A lot of that comes down to obviously the technology. And then you've got the whole piece about artificial intelligence. Where does that fit in? We've got all of the izations, we've got automation, robotization, digitization. Where does the human being fit in all of that?
Well, I think that we have an opportunity to recreate work. I will say that for a long time, when we talk about the izations coming to take our jobs, that the talk has mostly been about the atomization of work, so that AI or machine learning are not necessarily coming to take the entire job that you have. But in fact, in the same way that we talked about the gig economy as a sort of unbundling of a job, in the same way that iTunes unbundled the album, you're really looking at what are the different things that you can do that AI cannot. And those things are things that are not rote, things that only humans can do, the storytelling, the human connection, making people feel like they belong as part of the organization, making people feel safe so that they can voice all of their ideas, so that you can actually take advantage of diversity. And all those human elements, I think, are really important. On the flip side, actually, MIT just released their final Work of the Future report, and I thought it was really interesting because they said that automation is vastly overhyped and overshadowed by problems of inequality and really labor market issues. And those were a much bigger issue than automation and AI, which are really just at the beginning of a cycle. Human hands are still far more flexible than robot hands. And it's certainly something to think about, including the ethics, which humans have to decide. But I don't think that it's as overhyped. It's as important necessarily as we make it out to be. But it's great for media. It's got really good visuals. So I myself am obsessed with robots, and I've spoken to the humanoid robot, Sophia of Hanson Robotics here, just on the border of China. And so I'm always intrigued, but from a very practical perspective, as people running companies, I don't think it's something that we have to worry about in terms of replacing people.
But if we do think about the unbundling that you just mentioned and the increasing use of the technology, so what does that do to organizational models? What does it do to the corporation? It's kind of, they've been built in certain ways. I know you've got some views here in terms of the Chinese philosophy around the Western philosophy. So why don't you share some of your thinking around that?
Yeah, to be fair, I don't think that we are ready for that. I don't think that the companies that I speak to are altogether ready. When I was in consulting, for instance, they had people who would staff you on your next project. And that's sort of where we're going. And there's actually a lot of calls for CHROs to be on boards because of this, because fundamentally organizational design is changing. And yes, actually, I met the CEO of Hire, which is a white goods company in China, at Thinkers 50 in London, in fact. And he was talking about the Rendan He model, which basically is small startups of 8 people centered around the customer. And the entire company has been kind of disaggregated, unbundled, so that each of those units is separate. And, you know, as we talked about before, it allows you to be nimble, it's decentralized. You can see that in some guerrilla warfare where there's all these little pockets. I mean, this is an ecosystem as opposed to an empire. And so I remember us talking about, you know, the Western empires all fall, but ecosystems seem to be sustained and frankly weather disruption far better than most very rigid structures. But this is not just in the East. I mean, that happens to be a very famous Chinese company, and they happen to be buying a lot of other companies like GE and such. And actually, the companies they bought have performed incredibly well, which is telling. But you can start seeing this. Gary Hamel just put out a book called Humanocracy about how bureaucracy is evil and whatnot. So I do think it's a trend. It's part of the zeitgeist. And in China, where I've been for 20 years, you know, collectivist thinking is the norm. So perhaps it will be easier to do that. But I think that there are things happening all over the world in different places that are all bubbling up at the same time, which as often happens when, you know, and let's face it, right now we're all dealing with the same disruption in a way that has never happened before. So I expect in 10, 20 years, there will be fundamentally new models for organizational design. In the US, there's, you know, the founders of WordPress, GitHub, who have something like 1,600 employees and have always been a distributed workforce. So lots of fascinating ideas to look at if you're thinking about changing your work.
And you mentioned just there disruption, which of course is we've all been experiencing with a capital D over the course of the last few months. And I know you've got this sort of view around anti-fragile companies are going to learn best from disruption, and then they become increasingly resilient going forward. Have you come across examples of organizations yet that are really demonstrating that anti-fragile kind of way of working?
Absolutely. And it is in part companies that have gone through it before and have learned. So Toyota, for instance, during the tsunami, I don't know if you remember, but it was the time when everybody woke up to the reality that that all of this one particular part was coming from right around where the tsunami was, and that automobiles in most of the car manufacturers could not be built without this part. So they actually pioneered a database of suppliers so that they could, across both their suppliers, competitor suppliers, and that was intended to smooth capacity for cataclysmic events, which as it turns out are far more frequent than what we might like. But those are the kind of ideas that came out of previous crises that are now allowing them to kind of future-proof their supply chain. Companies like Netflix, I know that they've been doing super well because of the fact that we're all staying at home and in dire need of some entertainment, but they also have focused on this kind of getting stronger by stressing themselves. And they have a program called Chaos Monkeys, where they, and other companies do this too, but Netflix has purposely been having little hackers come in and try to basically knock them offline for a long time. And so by the time that they get to a place where all of a sudden their capacity needs to expand massively, they're ready for it. And Zoom, I guess, is a sort of younger company, but you can see the difference, right? The sort of playing catch up because we didn't expect anything versus a company who's starting to say, okay, actually, we know something's going to happen. So let's try to stress test ourselves. Another company out here, which I thought was interesting, given some of the comments that I've heard about governance and such from the other sessions, is Samsung and Hyundai, which are both in Korea. they had activist investors that were trying to tear them apart for having high cash balances. And in fact, then when this year hit, they looked very smart. And I don't know that, I don't know we all want to be hoarding cash. If we have it, I suppose some of us do. But now that you see things like blockchain securitization, which is happening all over Hong Kong, it's definitely the talk of the town. There's going to be things like that where people are thinking about being resilient, as opposed to, I would say, before, when there was a much bigger focus on efficiency, which is sometimes a bit fragile.
So are the boards having these conversations? I mean, from a governance perspective, are these things that they're kind of really looking into the future to say, what are we learning from the experiences of the last few months? How can we embed these things going forward? Or are they more of a coming to a stage of being relieved that this might be over and we can get back into a sense of kind of renewal?
I don't think anybody thinks it's over. I don't think anybody thinks it's over, but I have had a real, I feel like there's a bifurcation where some people are feeling like we're just trying to survive. Don't talk to us about the future. And other boards are really thinking about the fact that they have to have a long-term view, because they have to think about what the short-term, decisions they're making, what the long-term implications of those will be. And the future of work is a big one. Are we gonna, like Twitter, just tell everybody they can stay away and never come back to the office? That's a material decision for a company, and the board definitely needs to be thinking about that and how it fits into the overall strategy.
So one topic that's come up a lot during the course of these sessions, and that's kind of really high on agendas, I possibly think here in Europe and the US also, is the whole question of purpose. But is that getting into discussions in Asia as well?
Yeah, I think it's important, and there are certainly, if you look at some of the indices of, world-changing companies that are often allied with purpose, you see quite a lot of that happening. In Asia, I've been involved in the shared value movement, which Michael Porter started, Michael Porter from Harvard Business School. And that is companies gaining a competitive advantage, bringing their business assets to solve the world's biggest problems. And that has been something that's gaining interest, because on the one hand, there is a somewhat patriarchal, I would say, approach, in the sense that, of course, we take care of our stakeholders. When I did a session once with listed independent board directors, with the shared value creators, some of the folks there were saying, that makes good sense, but we've been doing that for 200 years. Thank you very much. But then there's others who are upstarts who are really starting to see how purpose can be a way to create that long-term view, so that you can, motivate people, so that you can understand risk, frankly, because a lot of the externalities that we're facing now are things that we used to just think, oh, we don't have to worry about that. That won't be a problem. Somebody else will deal with that. They've come up much more quickly. And so purpose is something that that people are talking about a lot. And globally, for instance, I know B Corps have been up in terms of registration 50% this year, and they're starting to make a lot of inroads in Asia. And part of it is that during the financial crisis, I think 63% or 65% that were B Corps were more likely to survive. So, you start to see now over time how companies that have purpose and can articulate it well, they can safeguard their reputation, they can attract the best talent, and they can actually align with some of the most pressing problems that we need to solve.
So that kind of ties into the world of the communications discipline, if you like, and not just being the communicator of that purpose, but I think it's also the different perspectives around being the influencer, of making sure that purpose comes to the fore, it gets embedded into the organization, you know, as a kind of way of living, and not just something that sits on a website or has some nice comms around it. So I can see that the clock is running really fast here, but I do want to ask this question because I'm curious. So, you know, you're a futurist. So what role does history play in the future?
Well, one of the principles of strategic foresight is actually to look back in order to look forward. And if you think about the patterns that you can see, it's a lot easier if you go back quite a long time versus, you know, what happened last year, what happened next year. Because the future and strategic foresight really is about patterns and signals and where they might go in 10 years, not next year. But I think at the same time, if you think too much about it, you can't dream about the future. So a lot of the work I do with clients is just taking them out of the reactivity of the moment and thinking about some of the things that could happen in 10 years. And I think that the remarkable thing is that actually most of those things are happening now when we start to articulate them. You know, the virtual reality that is being used for military training sounds kind of far out, but in fact is happening right now. Sensory communications where I can shake your hand and you can feel it. It's being developed in a garage that I visited in Los Angeles last year. So, you know, those are the kind of things that I get super excited about. And I think that this moment has been a wake-up call for those companies and people that are still slumbering to innovate because of necessity, to make the world a better place to work, to make the world a better place to live, a place where, you know, frontline workers are taken care of, where things, where people are taking care of each other, and where communities and business and NGOs are together and quite strong, moving into the future. Because I think that we've seen lately that it really can't be any other way. It is a system. It's an ecosystem, whether or not, you know, whether we like it or not.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like there's so many of the things that you've said, this is a kind of a call to action for all of us to be shaping the future that we want, rather than just kind of managing the future that arrives. And I think on that note, I can see there's lots of questions that are coming up in the chat. So we want to make sure that we can get to some of those. So hopefully we're going to be joined in a moment, I think, by Sandra to come and facilitate those. But why don't I just get going on one of them, which is all of these things you're talking about require culture change. So how do you tackle that?
That is very true. And I've seen culture change where none was wanted very much this year. So I think that the necessity breeding the innovation has been helpful. It's really allowed people to experiment in a way that wasn't really, it wasn't really comfortable for any of us, but it wasn't allowed in many corporations. And now, you know, we have to all be remote work. We have to suddenly get a lot better at communication. And so that's happened without the culture change. And I think that what's going to happen now as we move forward is for people to get together and say, okay, what about that do we want to keep? And what about these things do we want to put into our culture? You know, a lot of people have very strong cultures, and that's great. Some people maybe found out stuff about their culture that they didn't know, like, you know, that everybody would take off at the first moment. I know that there was a bank in Hong Kong, and speaking of transparency, they were during the workday and they were up on the peak and they were hiking and having a fun time, and they all put it on Instagram, and then they all got reprimanded. So, you know, it brought to light for this bank, you know, what kind of company are we? We've just sent everybody home. We've allowed remote work. We say we allow people to work from anywhere. They're on the peak and it's on Instagram. is that going to be part of our culture moving forward? Maybe it is.
Maybe indeed. Sandra, how about I hand back to you for the moment?
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, Diana. As you say, lots of great questions coming through. If I can ask Andrew Lowe. Andrew, can you join us and unmute yourself? Welcome. Hi, Andrew.
Hi. Thank you, Echo and Diana, for a really insightful couple of minutes. Like I could keep listening, but one of the things that jumped out for me, and one of the things that we see and feel in client conversations, is there's a lot that's great and that's been forced upon us, and we've adapted quickly, and we hope that we retain that. But there's this sense of the human element that is lacking, or that is as yet irreplaceable. So, you know, creativity, connection, compassion from more junior levels in the organization, you know, learning by osmosis and presence is really important. So I'd love your view on how the future tackles or looks at that particular element, the human side of the future of work.
That's a great question. Thank you, Andrew. There are people who are talking about fundamentally changing the physical spaces that we work in to accommodate some of that, and thinking about, you know, when do you need to be in the office? So Rosie alluded, I sit on the board of the American Chamber. We just sold our property, and we're talking about that. You know, we don't need that many big rooms, and, you know, we can be in our clients' offices. When do we actually need to be together? And I think a lot of companies are talking about that, and frankly, redoing their offices to accommodate that. The other thing is that we are adapting. So I know that one of the big apparel companies here has decided to use this moment to be more transparent. And the CEO has taken his sort of next generation leaders and started to have weekly calls with them. And it's to go through his decision making. He's never done it before, but he's actually saying to them, look, I don't know if this is the right thing to do. This has never happened. I don't have a playbook, but this is going to happen again. So why don't we get you guys together, and I'll just talk about what I'm thinking about doing, and you guys can ask questions. It'll make me smarter about how we go forward, but it's also training the next generation in a way that they wouldn't get if they're just being asked to stay at home and be on their team calls and execute whatever's been decided. So I see people starting to get more creative that way. But you're right, there is this human element that that is difficult to replicate. And I think that now we're looking at how we can maximize that, and also not take it for granted, not, you know, have gratuitous flights. As Sandra mentioned, people are going to travel less. So how can we commit to time to each other? And some of it is just as simple as not being efficient during meetings and having, like, you know, GitHub has coffee, random guys coffee chats, and, you know, all these things that we kind of laugh at, but are in most distributed work companies, they feel are fundamental to their ability to succeed. And most of them do have some in-person get together and element to them. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting one to watch. And I look forward to seeing what you think coming from Corn Ferry, because you're going to be on the front line.
Yeah, I'm both answering that question for ourselves and also for our clients. I think anecdotally, we had a town hall yesterday with our CEO. Our real estate, by region, it will be nuanced, but in the US, it will probably diminish by 30-40% versus what it is today. Equally, if I look at where our activity levels are, there is a really intense focus on development, on leadership, and on culture change. So, you know, if anything, if you had said to him back in March, Gary, would you take 30% off year on year? that probably would have felt like an acceptable hedge to us, Korn Ferry, but actually it's about 5% off. Companies are investing and thinking about their people, which is hugely encouraging. But yeah, no, we don't have the answers yet. I think we're all collectively as a human race going to have to figure our way through this step by step.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Diana. We've got time, if they're quite short, 2 more quick questions if we can get to it. Katerina Auer, if you can ask your question, and then I'll go to Julian Hilton Johnson.
Okay, have I unmuted myself?
Perfect.
The cry of 2020. Yeah, I was going to come back to the purpose question, especially now with so much change that has happened in an unscheduled, unplanned manner, but potentially beneficial change. Yet you have, how do you prevent purpose becoming another bandwagon that's marketed by agencies and then imposed sort of on an organization when it bears no resemblance to the real purpose, which should really be articulated by the employees, or at least with the employees. So if your focus is total shareholder return, how do you stop people from wanting to be purposeful?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I've been pondering a lot. And I think that one of the things that I've heard, even working with shared value, you can say you're doing something, but if it's not a material part of your business, is it really that important? And the reality is, after looking through and doing a lot of research, in fact, it is where things are fundamental to the business that that is more important. And one of the gauges was, if you're willing to forego a merger or acquisition because it doesn't fit with your purpose, then your purpose is strong. And I see that actually happening. One of the folks in our Future Proof course said that he had one of the social media giants as his client, and it was sort of a $500 million contract. And the new CEO came in and said, "That's not what we're about." It was kind of gutting for him, but that's the kind of decisions that you see. I mean, fundamentally, though, they are those kind of questions. I mean, there are questions between good and maybe a bit better, and really, though, a move to, I think, longer term thinking, which allows you to say, I'm going to sacrifice maybe the loss of that contract in the short term because it positions me well for the long term, in terms of growth, and it allows me to reduce a risk that could be really cataclysmic if we just leave it unchecked and we don't talk about it.
Thanks, Katerina. Thank you, Diana. Quick question, last question from Julian Hilton Johnson. Hi, Julian.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sandra, and thank you very much, Diana. This really has been fascinating, so thank you. My question is a bit like Andrew's in some respects. So there is so much change going on with the world of work, with AI, increased expectations around diversity and inclusion, all those sorts of things. And the change is only going to get more intense and more exponential. And companies are doing lots of things. And we've seen that companies, to be fair to them, have adapted very well, or very quickly, shall we say, to the requirements of COVID in terms of working and all that kind of stuff. A friend of mine has worked in a financial services organization. She said they've been discussing home working for 10 years, and it was always impossible. And they got it working within about 8 working days. But at the same time, when we're needing employees to be to interact with advanced technologies, we need their brain power. Employees are still feeling increasingly disconnected, unappreciated, and overworked. And I know this is a very big question, and we only have a few minutes, but companies seem to be applying band-aids rather than actually addressing the root causes. So do you have any thoughts on how companies can be more strategic or holistic, recognizing that's a very big question in a very short time? But it doesn't seem to me that any companies, at least I know, do it well.
Okay, well, I'll answer that question, even though you haven't finished, Julian.
Please do, thank you.
Because it's probably a 2-hour answer, but I'll try to do it in 2 minutes. And I will say that I do think things are changing because it's going up in terms of importance in the hierarchy, which is crumbling, I suppose, because you see more boards bringing people in that have HR expertise, that have talent expertise. And frankly, the conversations around the table have not been, boards, have been thinking, okay, we got to hire and fire the CEO, but it hasn't been, even maybe the last 5 years that they've been bringing people on and having conversations about how to fundamentally structure their talent, because it is the last competitive advantage that they have. And it is the only way that they can adapt. And if they don't do it, then, then they're toast. I mean, maybe they'll tread water on whatever competitive advantage they have, but really is, power to the people, I suppose. And that by its nature will make it more strategic, but it probably needs to happen faster than most companies are doing it.
Tremendous. What a great,
later.
I'll connect the two of you. What a great way to end. Thank you, Rosie, Diana, for bringing us to such an uplifting and inspiring and challenging close to our summit. As I've done throughout this series, I'd like to leave us all with a final quote, not Abraham Lincoln, but actually from Mahatma Gandhi, saying, "The future depends on what we do in the present." Diana, as you said, clearly the future is now, and now is the time. Thank you all for being with us, for your great support throughout this program. We've welcomed our clients, friends, and supporters from across 9 countries and time zones to a series with amazing speakers. I hope you've enjoyed these nuggets of wisdom and found some useful learnings and perspectives along the way. We will be sending to all of you who've joined us a very brief white paper. I've been touching on some highlights and some nuggets of research on trust and expectations at a time of COVID. And we would just simply love to keep these conversations going. Thank you to all our deeply insightful speakers, our highly engaged participants, you've been wonderful, and clearly the tremendous Echoistas. There's so much more to come from Echo, especially in the new year. So please keep in touch and let's keep talking. And finally, thank you for such great feedback. These events would not be the same without everyone who has taken part. Thank you and see you all very soon.